The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show with me, Charles Christian. Now, we have another great interview coming up for you in a moment, but before we get to that, let's follow up on an item we ran last time when I suggested that this year, why don't we take the Christmas decorations down, not on 12th night, but instead keep them up till Candlemas, which is the 2nd of February. Crazy idea, you say? Well, not that crazy, as it was common practice for hundreds of years in England, until about the mid-19th century when the prissy Victorians started spoiling everyone's fun. It was also about the same time the old English fairs and markets, which were notorious for being bawdy, drunken, outrageous places. A lot of fun, in fact, were abolished by the Victorians. Anyway, don't just take my word for it, because English Heritage, the organisation that looks over 400 historic houses and places across England, is also now calling for people to leave up festive decorations until Candlemas. They say it will help bring cheer in the dark winter months, especially as, in the UK at least, we're in the middle of another coronavirus lockdown. So, when should you put up your Christmas decorations? Once again, opinions vary. Early to mid-December is the most popular time, with St. Nicholas Day, 5th of December, a favourite. But let's push the envelope a little further and start at Advent, which this year coming will be Sunday the 28th of November, 2021. Well, that's my suggestion. But English Heritage, them again, point out that in the 16th century, Yuletide celebrations began at Halloween and continued until Candlemas, meaning the festivities lasted almost a quarter of the year. Second thoughts, that's an idea, isn't it? Right, time for our interview. And in the hot seat today is Dr. Stephen Braude, who is going to be talking about the paranormal investigations he's been involved with, including the Gold Leaf Lady of Florida. More about her later. Dr. Braude's perspective is unusual in that he's a university academic and philosophy professor. Here's his bio in full. Stephen Braude is Emeritus Professor and former Chair of Philosophy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's a past president of the Parapsychological Association, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including a fellowship from the National Endowment for Humanities and the prestigious F.W.H. Myers Memorial Medal from the Society for Psychical Research. His earliest research was in logic and the philosophies of language and time. After that, he shifted focus to the evidence of psychic phenomena to see if he could provide new insights in traditional problems in the philosophy of science and philosophy of the mind. He also turned his attention to hypnosis and multiple personalities, writing extensively on the unity of consciousness and psychopathology. In addition to approximately 100 published articles, he's written 6 books, including ESP and Psychokinesis, a philosophical examination, The Limits of Influence, Psychokinesis and the Philosophy of Science, and The Gold Leaf Lady and Other Parapsychological Investigations. His latest book is Crimes of Reason, on Mind, Nature and the Paranormal. Stephen is also a professional jazz pianist and composer. It's my great pleasure to be talking to Dr. Stephen Braude. Now, Stephen, we've got a lot of topics to cover here, but you're a professor of philosophy. So what
Correct.
got you into investigating the paranormal?
Well, it all began back in graduate school when I was busy writing a dissertation on temporal logic. And in those days, I knew absolutely nothing about parapsychology. And in fact, in those days, I considered myself to be a kind of hard-nosed materialist. Not for any particularly good reason. It was just the kind of intellectual conceit I was cultivating at the time. And it was a slow day in Northampton, Massachusetts, and a couple of friends came over, and we'd seen the only movie in town. And so they said, well, let's play this game called Table Up. What they meant was, let's have a seance.
Right.
Now, I'd never done anything like that, and I knew nothing about parapsychology, and actually my friends didn't either. They just thought this was a game, but that when it worked, it was a lot of fun. So for the next 3 hours in my house with my table, in broad daylight, my table tilted up and down in response to questions. We were standing next to the table, so we were clearly not lifting it with our knees. The table was rising under our fingers. You know, I doubt that there's any way I can describe this that would quell all sorts of skeptical concerns, but I can tell you that, again, it was my table, my house, my conditions. My friends were not practical jokers. I don't even think they had a sense of humor, for that matter. And if one of the friends had left the room, there were just two of us left at the table, and it was still rising under our fingers. So I realized that I probably couldn't discuss this with my mentors.
Yes.
And I think that was, in retrospect, that was a wise decision. So I literally put it out of mind until I got my PhD, got a job, got tenure after publishing what I hope still is respectable research in the philosophy of language and time. And then I remembered what happened to me back in grad school. And I figured if I was an honest intellectual and philosopher, I needed to come to grips with this. But I also knew that some famous philosophers had actually studied the evidence in parapsychology. So I read what they had to say and decided there was indeed something worth sinking my teeth into. And the rest is history. I'm now about as much of an insider in that community as one can be.
And how long a period is this covering from?
This was back in the mid-1970s.
Right. So, yes, considerable period of time.
Yes.
Yeah. What sort of cases or what sort of things do you focus on when it comes to the paranormal then?
Well, from the point of view of an investigator of cases, I'm more interested in physical phenomena that can be documented with video, and also reliable physical phenomena. So I tend to avoid poltergeist cases because they're too sporadic. Unless it's something that seems to be so regular that there's a likelihood of something happening. I mean, you know, it shouldn't surprise you to learn that the philosophy department at the University of Maryland didn't have provisions in its budget for paranormal case investigations. So I had to either ride on media's coattails or wait for research funding to come my way or to fund them myself. So I focused on cases like the one of the gold leaf lady where the phenomena were regular, and I stood a good chance of observing them myself.
Right. Now, tell us about the gold leaf lady.
This was a woman in Florida whose body would erupt spontaneously and instantaneously in a kind of golden-colored foil. People could hold her hands. They sometimes would see the arms and the hands start to glisten, and then instantly it would be covered in this foil. She was also a good all-round psychic, I have to mention. She would help the police to solve crimes. Although she was functionally illiterate with only a first-grade education, when in a mediumistic trance, she could write out quatrains in medieval French, ostensibly from Nostradamus. That was cool to watch, by the way. But the gold foil was really, the golden foil, it wasn't really gold, it was brass. But that was really extraordinary. And I have lots of it. I've collected lots of it scraped off her body.
I was going to say that was the next question. You were able to collect it and analyze it, and as you say, it turned out to be brass.
Yes, 80% copper, 20% zinc. It looks in its structure and superficial appearance very much like a kind of brass leaf that you can buy in art supply stores as a inexpensive way of gilding picture frames.
Yep, I know what you mean. Yeah.
So what we don't know about the case is whether this foil is something she materialized or something she apported from elsewhere. And we never got to the bottom of that. That, in some ways, is the remaining mystery of the case. I think I understand the psychodynamics of the case, but not what the phenomenon is. And the psychodynamics are that Katie none of her psychic abilities appeared until she married her second husband. And by all accounts, it was a difficult marriage. So in some ways, Katie's case resembles the classic poltergeist profile. And, in a poltergeist case, the agent is usually a disturbed teenager or adolescent, somebody with deep emotional problems and no conventional way of getting them off his or her chest. Yeah. And so the phenomena seem to erupt like a kind of brute psychic flailing about. And Katie's case started in that way. Objects in the house were moving around, rearranging themselves, appearing and disappearing. And one day a carving set appeared apparently out of nowhere. And Katie's husband said to her, well, what good is it if it isn't money? And then 2 days later, her body started to break out in this golden-colored foil. So if you want my pop psychological analysis of this, it would be that symbolically this satisfies Katie's husband's demand for something valuable, but Katie didn't really have to bear the responsibility of being the goose that laid the golden egg. And, not insignificantly, this was a way, I think, she could safely express her rage against her husband because he wanted something valuable and she was giving him fool's gold. She was giving him the psychic finger.
Yes. Did she stay with the second husband as far as
Yes, I think she felt trapped in the relationship.
Yeah. But I mean, she didn't, there wasn't a sort of sequel where she left him and her powers disappeared or anything like that.
No, and we never were able to really correlate the appearance of the phenomena with what was going on in her life. Sometimes during periods of great overt stress, nothing would happen. And then even during periods of tranquility, the foil might be appearing for months on end. She said sometimes she would wake up every morning covered in the foil. She could be going to a convenience store and buying something, and suddenly her face would break out in this foil. And, what do you say to the cashier under those circumstances? This was kind of an affliction for her. It is not something she did voluntarily. Nothing, yes. She had no control over it.
Did you actually see that appearing on her?
Yes, I did. On a couple of occasions, yes.
And there was no obvious mechanism? I mean, was it oozing out of the pores in her skin or?
No, sometimes her skin would glisten initially and then the foil would just be there. So I think if she was sweating it or exuding it somehow, I think she would have had to have lethal amounts of copper and zinc in her system, but medical tests never showed any corresponding anomalies.
Yeah.
Now, somebody once suggested that she might have dissolved the copper in a kind of liquid, applied the liquid to her skin, and then when it evaporated, the copper would be left there. But as material scientists assured me on several occasions, if that had been the case, it would have had a crystalline structure, not a rolled granular structure.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see that, yes. So that particular case is just left hanging, that
yes.
the solution or the explanation just doesn't exist. Yeah.
But my interest in the case, though, I mean, where I think the real action in parapsychology needs to be is on the psychodynamics of it. I think, first of all, we need to examine extraordinary subjects who can do astounding things with a certain degree of regularity. And see, I think laboratory experiments in parapsychology are almost absurdly premature. We have no idea what we're trying to bring into the lab to study it. It might be as inappropriate as trying to study sensuality or courage under laboratory conditions.
One of the other topics you've looked at is the German Kai Müger.
Müger, yes.
Müger. You've studied him. do you take the view he is a fraudulent physical medium, or is he like the gold leaf lady, someone who's doing something but they don't quite know how or why it's happening?
Well, I certainly would not say he's a total fraud. I believe to some extent Kai is the real deal. I've seen phenomena under conditions that I think cannot be explained away. I've been draped all over Kai, controlling all 4 of his limbs, and even at the same time controlling his wife, while phenomena happened out of his reach at a considerable distance. I've experienced table levitations with Kai that I think can't be explained away. For example, the table levitating for about 20 seconds or more and swaying back and forth to the rhythm of the music playing in the background. But we also know that Kai has cheated. There's no doubt about it. And I don't want to excuse it, but I think cheating in a case of a physical medium who wants to be a guru and who has got paying customers he doesn't want to disappoint is perfectly understandable.
Yes. Yeah. So what form does the cheating take? Because, I mean, we've all seen pictures of fake mediums with ectoplasm that's, made from egg white and cloth, and they're regurgitating and things like that. What have you encountered with Kai?
Well, we have some clear evidence that he used a little device that manipulated the movement of a small LED with his finger.
Right.
So once we know he learned that trick, we don't know how many others he might have learned at the same time. And so I've done some experiments with Kai that I think were conducted under pretty good conditions, quite good conditions, I would say. We've done strip searches of Kai, and he still produced ectoplasm under conditions described in my book, Dangerous Pursuits. What I didn't do was a full cavity search. That goes well beyond my philosophical training.
Yes.
And so we can't rule out that he didn't regurgitate some of the stuff that I've seen him pull out of his mouth. Although I have to say, he ate shortly before this. He drank black tea, all of which would have left some, you would expect, some remnants on the stuff he pulled out of his mouth.
Yes.
But that leaves the rectum hypothesis, and we can't rule that one out, unfortunately. And in fact, there was a well-known Hungarian medium whose modus operandi was, in fact, to stuff things up his rectum.
Right. How did he actually produce it when it came? You can understand it if you've got it in your throat. How does it come out of your rectum? Well, I mean, I know how it comes out, but I mean, how do you actually manifest it at a seance?
Well, in the darkness of a cabinet.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Did you start as a total skeptic and you've now moved over to believing where the evidence supports it, or?
Well, my first book on parapsychology, at first when I got into this, I accepted pretty much the received view that if there was good evidence, it needed to come from the laboratory and controlled, repeatable experiments. And so my first book dealt pretty much just with that body of evidence. But then I figured if I was really going to be a serious scholar of parapsychology, I needed to know the other material that most people were, I now realize, ignorantly dismissing. Even parapsychologists who hadn't read it for themselves, they were just taking it on faith or the word of others who hadn't read it, just the secondary literature, perhaps. Mm-hmm. So I went back to the beginning and I read the cases of D.D. Hume, Eusapia Palladino, and so on. I started with physical mediumship and was totally blown away by the quality of the best cases. And then I realized to what extent most parapsychologists, those who at least called themselves that and were members of the Parapsychological Association or the SPR, they really didn't know what they were talking about. And then it also occurred to me that someday when I was more chronologically challenged, as I am currently, I'd probably be interested in the evidence for life after death. So I knew I at some point wanted to write a book on that. But then I realized that if I was going to write a book on the evidence for survival of bodily death, I needed to write a book on multiple personality, because people suffering from dissociative disorders look an awful lot like what you see in cases of mediumship. So I figured that was an essential precursor. So I studied multiple personality for a number of years and wrote a book on that. Then I wrote my book on life after death, and a few books followed that.
Yes, yeah. The life after death, is that immortal remains?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. What has been your conclusion?
I'm still working on that one.
Yeah.
I know what I'd like to be the case. I think it's extraordinarily difficult to rule out, in particular, the hypothesis of psychic functioning among the living or living agents.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
And where are you heading at the moment with your writing and your research?
Well, I just finished a book called Dangerous Pursuits.
Mm-hmm.
And my book before that was called Crimes of Reason. And I thought when I finished that, it was a collection of essays that I updated and expanded and revised. When I finished Crimes of Reason, I thought I was all booked out, done with big projects.
Yeah.
But after a while, I realized that I was unsatisfied with what I'd left in print about a bunch of other topics. I mean, years of thinking about those topics had made me see how I missed certain subtleties or neglected points I now see as important, or how I could have made certain arguments more compelling and clear. And that's what led to Dangerous Pursuits. And so now I feel again that I'm all booked out. Mm-hmm. Unless I write a projected book on how cats spend their time.
Well, that would probably be a huge commercial success given social media and everyone's obsessions with their cats. Can we talk about Carlos Mirabelli? Tell me something about him.
An amazing case. Again, another mixed medium like Kai. We know that Carlos cheated on occasion. But the reason the case is so important is that his phenomena are the most dramatic of materializing mediums. He would materialize full human figures in broad daylight or otherwise bright artificial light. Physicians could examine the materialized figures and check for normal bodily functions like stomach growlings and heart beatings and lung working and so on. And then the figures would melt into the floor. And this was observed on many, many occasions by many, many people. In one case I know about, there was a loud noise in the seance room, and to the amazement of the sitters, they found among them an old man. And two of the sitters recognized the figure as that of a physician who had recently deceased. So they took photos of the form, and the form was examined for about 15 minutes by two medical men who said that it appeared to be a normal human being. And after the examination was over, the figure dissolved away from the feet upwards until only the upper part of the body remained floating in the air. And then one of the doctors who had examined the figure rushed forward and seized the half of the body that was still floating in front of him. And he cried out and sank to the ground unconscious, while what was left of the body disappeared instantly. And when the doctor recovered, he told the sitters that what he felt was a spongy, flaccid mass of substance, and that at that point he experienced some kind of shock and fell to the ground.
Right, and
pretty great.
Nobody else has ever come up with anything like that, have they? Or not?
Well, there have been full figure materializations galore, a lot of them fraudulent, no doubt.
Yeah.
But nobody who's produced full human figures that have been examined minutely by physicians and then disappeared in such a compelling way. I mean, we don't have the technology to duplicate that.
Yeah. No, exactly. It's like something out of Star Trek, isn't it?
Yes. Similar to Star Trek, Mirabelli would sometimes just disappear and appear elsewhere. And one famous, his most famous disappearance was the apparent spontaneous transportation from a train station in Sao Paulo to a place about 50 miles away. According to witnesses, he simply vanished from the platform where he'd been standing among friends. And after about 15 minutes, the concerned friends got through by telephone to the home where they'd all been heading. And they were told that Mirabelli had been there for the past 15 minutes.
I'm lost for words on that one because, again, it raises far more questions than you can possibly answer. But again, what explanations has anybody been able to work out how he's doing it or what it is? Not
that I'm aware of. And my feeling is that until we have a good natural history of psi phenomena and study the superstars, the people who express the phenomena in their most extreme or dramatic forms, we'll have no idea what it's doing out there in the world. I mean, I've even argued that so-called meaningful coincidences, synchronicities, are probably psychokinetic productions on a large scale. You know, there's an old Yiddish distinction between a schlemiel and a schlemazel. The idea is that a schlemiel is someone who spills soup on himself, but a schlemazel has it spilt on him. Right. So the idea is that a schlemazel is a victim of impersonal forces or the universe at large, someone the world is just crapping on. And schlemazels really exist. I mean, I was married to a schlemazel at one point. In fact, her whole family was a lightning rod for misfortune. I'd rather not discuss that case, actually, but
no, certainly not.
I lived next door to a pair of schlemazels. They were great. I mean, it seemed like everything they bought was defective. Their cars were always in the shop, even though they had brands noted for their reliability. Electronic equipment would fail to work right out of the box. A solid wooden rocking chair they bought fell apart the second day they owned it with their infant son sitting on it. And my favorite example of their schlemazelness, if that's even a word,
is now.
The wife bought a poster-sized photo of what she thought was the Golden Gate Bridge, and she had it framed and put on her living room wall. And I had to tell her, Donna, that's the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, your listeners probably don't know this, but it's an old image of a sucker or loser, or a gullible person who somebody tries to sell the Brooklyn Bridge to. So here's a woman who both literally and figuratively bought the Brooklyn Bridge. So the question that arises is this one way in which psychic functioning manifests itself in daily life? I mean, we know we can make ourselves sick or well by thought alone. Can we also make ourselves miserable? Could this be one way in which we express our self-hatred? Or could this have been caused by the peculiar philosopher living next door? So, I mean, this is what's at stake if we take psychic phenomena seriously.
What was Mirabelli's background? I mean, where did he come from?
Well, he's a Brazilian. I forget what his parents' lineage was, but his phenomena started appearing when he was working in a shoe store, and objects started flying off the shelves and chasing him out into the street. And strangely enough, the people at the shoe store thought that meant he needed to be put in an asylum. Fortunately, and he was institutionalized. Fortunately, the doctors in the asylum didn't think he was crazy. They thought he was special, and they studied him, and they eventually released him. And then Mirabelli seemed to realize that he had a good thing going here, and he made a career out of it.
But yes, there's no sort of anything in the family or anything of that nature, or didn't come from a family of theatre folk or anything like that. So
not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, there's nothing on that weird level there.
Part of my problem with the case of Mirabelli is that most of the work about him is in Portuguese and it's untranslated. I've done the best I can with it. And there have been there's a good book by Guy Playfair, the late Guy Playfair, on dealing with Mirabelli.
What about eyewitness accounts of other people seeing weird phenomena? Can you trust them or distrust them? Or
I think you can. I mean, first of all, we have to recognize that the cases that matter, the ones that are most difficult to explain away. And the ones that are most difficult to explain away are the ones where the phenomena occurred in a way that allowed witnesses to examine them while they were occurring, where the phenomena occurred under good light. Witnesses were not taken by surprise. They knew in advance what to look out for, and so on. And there are plenty of those cases. So what I object to in a lot of the skeptical writing on the topic is that they commit one of the most egregious elementary fallacies, and they generalize from the weakest cases. But may I give you a good example?
Yes, indeed. Please do.
The medium D.D. Hume at the end of the 19th century was examined by, among other people, Sir William Crookes. One of Hume's most notorious phenomena was making accordions play music on request, or maybe not on request, but while floating around the room untouched, or at least held at the end away from the keys so that a musical performance could not occur. Now, Hume claimed that the phenomena were strongest under the seance table. And admittedly, that sounds a little fishy. But Crookes was a smart guy, and he realized that if this is what Hume genuinely believed, it would be bad procedure to force him too much or any more than necessary out of his comfort zone, and better to find a way of studying the phenomena under the table. So here's what he did. First of all, he bought a new accordion. So nobody could claim that it was a prop of Hume's.
Yeah.
And he went to Hume's apartment, watched him change clothes so he could determine that Hume wasn't concealing some device on his body. Although this was 1871, it's not clear what kind of device this could possibly have been.
Yes.
Then he brought Hume to his house, where he'd constructed a cage made out of wire and wood that just fit under his dining room table. There was room for Hume to get his hand in under the tabletop to hold the accordion at the end away from the keys, but not enough to reach all the way in to manipulate the keys. Yeah. It's too bad you can't see the helpful hand gestures I'm making here. There were 9 people present at the time, all members of the Royal Society. 2 stationed on either side of Hume to make sure he wasn't taking his feet out of his boots. Another one stationed under the table with a lamp. Under those conditions, the accordion was seen to float around, expand and contract. The keys were depressed. Sounds came out. Then Crookes asked Hume to take his hand out of the cage, put both hands on the table. He then ran an electric current through the cage, and the accordion was still seen to flop around inside the cage. Now, I consider that to be one of the strongest experiments in the history of parapsychology, and no magician, no skeptic has ever tried to duplicate that under conditions anything like what those in which Hume succeeded. And I think for good reason. They just can't. So questioning eyewitness testimony under those conditions is, I think, absurd.
Yes. We're talking there about the late 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, up to post-World War I. That does seem to have been the high point for seances and physical mediums. Would you say that was correct? Yes, that was the heyday of physical mediumship, without a doubt. And I think something interesting happened at that point. I mean, first of all, people wonder why we don't see so much of it anymore. And it's a reasonable question, but I think it has a reasonable answer. And the first part of that reasonable answer is that the great mediums during that period literally believed that they were mediums. That is, they didn't think that they were producing a phenomena. They thought they were mediating it. And that's very convenient psychologically. It takes them off the hook no matter what happens. So if only uninteresting phenomena occur, or if no interesting phenomena occur, then the medium doesn't have to feel like a failure. She can always attribute the lack of success to an inept communicator or to a bad link to the spirit world. But maybe more important, if good phenomena occur, the medium doesn't have to fear the extent of her power. She doesn't have to think,
wow, if I can do this under the relatively safe conditions of a seance, who knows what havoc I might be wreaking when the seance is over.
Mm-hmm.
And so the mediums didn't have to fear what Freud called the omnipotence of thought, this idea that we might have to potentially take responsibility for a range of things we'd just as soon be bystanders for. I mean, that's a magical worldview that most of us associate, usually condescendingly, only with so-called primitive cultures.
Yeah, yeah.
And if I may add,
Yeah.
one interesting thing that happened is as more and more non-spiritists got into the investigating business, and, like scientists taking over the investigations, not other spiritists, the idea that the medium might be responsible, might be the agent and not just the medium, became more widespread. And even if the mediums didn't accept it themselves, this was an idea that was increasingly in the air, so to speak. And what I find intriguing about that is that the phenomena dwindled in magnitude. So except for Mirabelli, but he was off in Brazil where spiritism was alive and well.
Mm-hmm.
But in the UK and in the rest of Europe, the phenomena were definitely smaller scale. So by the time you get to Eusapia Palladino, her phenomena weren't as dramatic as those of Hume. And by the time you get to the Schneider brothers, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, the phenomena were a much smaller scale. But by that time, more and more people thought the mediums were actually producing it. And by the mid-20th century, when you get to people like Nina Kulagina and Felicia Paris, they would sweat and strain to make a compass needle or a matchstick move a millimeter. And how convenient is that from their point of view? If they figure they have to work so hard to produce that phenomenon, they don't have to worry about making tables levitate or making people drop dead. From their point of view, they'd have to suffer internal hemorrhaging before that happened.
Yeah, yeah. So have you any theories as to what caused that? Is it that they don't make mediums like they used to do, or is it something in the world that's changed? I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind is the fact that we moved from the era of gas lamps to electricity, and also radio became a phenomenon. Was there some kind of scientific electrical phenomenon there that was maybe interfering with their powers, or?
It's an interesting conjecture. I don't know. I wouldn't just rule it out. I mean, that may be. What I wonder is whether there was a kind of conspiracy among the community of minds to keep the violators of the rules from going too far. I mean, I think there's a generalized fear of psychic phenomena that operates at a very, very deep level. And just as we put lawbreakers in jail, we might try through the community of minds to constrain people who violate these other laws.
Well, certainly people are frightened by those kind of powers. And indeed, the Stephen King book movie, Carrie, is a good example, really epitomizing that, isn't it?
Yes, a more revealing version of that fear is the way otherwise smart people resort to really stupid arguments to try to debunk the evidence in parapsychology, where they immediately start generalizing from the weakest cases or coming up with ad hominem arguments. These are arguments they'd know to be fallacious if they were ever directed toward them. So it's as if a veil of stupidity descends over people and they go into a kind of conceptual panic.
Yes. And presumably another issue is that the people who are the mediums, most of them don't come from an academic background and aren't really in a position to put together coherent, tightly argued cases to defend themselves.
There's a lot of snobbery about the social status of the people who tend to produce the phenomenon.
Yeah. What's the current situation in the United States with mediumship? Is it Is there anything going there, or is it dead, or is it just sort of people doing party tricks, really?
Well, physical mediumship, there's not that much going on as far as I'm aware. Quite a lot of mental mediumship, of course. That always seems to have a market.
Yeah. Psychokinesis, which obviously is an aspect of the physical mediumship.
Right.
Again, is there any research going on into that at the moment?
Not much that I'm aware of. Most of the concentration among the experimentalists is on remote viewing, more Gansfeld work, a lot of work on precognition.
Yeah.
But I actually think that precognition may need to be explained psychokinetically.
This is going back to your coincidences, and
Yes.
I believe you've recently been to Buenos Aires to
Yes.
to study another psychokinesis PK subject.
Yes, Ariel Farias, a great guy, an honest person, I believe. Someone who, like many others, started out as a kind of poltergeist agent. When he was in his early teens and his father died, that was very upsetting to him, and objects would shatter and fly off shelves and so on. And even today, when he gets agitated, things will fly off shelves. But he found out in a study that was being conducted in table tipping at a research center in Buenos Aires that he could make tables rise just by placing his hands lightly on top of them. He doesn't do full table levitations, but what he does is very compelling. And he's willing to be photographed from all angles, and he's very cooperative. He's, in that way, a perfect subject.
Mm-hmm.
There are good videos of Ariel doing his thing. If people read the Journal of Scientific Exploration, of which I'm currently editor-in-chief, we've published 2 articles on Ariel, and there are links in those articles to videos where people who are interested can see what he does.
Right. And again, your view is this is a natural ability he has as opposed to a trick he's learned.
I can't see what the trick would be. His hands are not sticky. In fact, they get very cold. We can see the table. The table is placed on scales, as is Ariel himself, and we can watch changes in weight. The table starts changing weight even before it lifts off the ground. And Ariel actually finds that useful. He knows he's on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
But he claims that what he feels is going on is that he merges with the table.
Is your view then that there possibly is a lot more psychokinetic powers out there that people have but don't realize, and maybe just go through life saying, oh, that was a coincidence, or, oh, that was strange, but they're not really thinking, I just made that move.
Right. Well, that's why I say we don't know the natural history of psychic functioning. We don't know what it might be doing under the surface. We might all be virtuosi under the surface, and the really oddball people are those who can manifest it conspicuously when with some regularity.
Yeah.
So, for all we know, our psychic functioning could be working to aggravate a despised coworker's arthritis, or to mess with their computer, or to hide our socks, or to find parking spaces, or who knows what.
Yes. That's an intriguing idea, that, because, yes, I think we've all encountered that phenomenon like that. Something goes missing and then it turns up again, but you are absolutely certain you've searched everywhere, and it can only explanation is it somehow disappeared and then rematerialized at a later point. Yeah.
Mary Rose Barrington wrote a book about those kinds of events she calls them jots.
Oh, just one of those
things.
Yes. That's a fascinating topic, that. So you think, yes, jots could possibly have a PK or psychic element to them.
Yes, and until we get a grip on that, how can we possibly know what we're doing when we try to bring the phenomena into a laboratory setting. All we're going to get is straitjacketed manifestations of psychic functioning at best.
Apart from yourself, how much other research is going on into psychokinesis and parapsychology?
Well, not what I'd like to see.
Yeah.
There are people who are doing it, but there are very few institutional rewards, at least at the university level. So there are a few private foundations in the U.S. working, but actually the UK has more university support for parapsychological studies than in the U.S. And I think it would have been professionally fatal for me to have tried to do what I've managed to do if I had done it before getting tenure.
This is obviously a similar phenomenon with anybody who is trying to investigate what is generally termed paranormal phenomena. I mean, whether it's cryptozoology or anything else, that it's
right.
Fear, isn't it, that the respectable, in quotes, scientific community will laugh at you.
I've taken a lot of heat for what I do. And so the fact that I couldn't be fired made it all worthwhile.
Now, your website says you is the jazz philosopher, and we understand the philosophy bit because you were the former chair of philosophy at Maryland, Baltimore County. But where's
Correct.
The jazz part come in?
Well, I had a dual existence. I've been playing professionally as a jazz pianist since I was 16. But I preferred to have a job I couldn't get fired from.
Yes.
So I wanted something more secure. And I realized pretty early on that if I went into university life, I wouldn't have to stop making music. But if I went into music, I wouldn't be able to sustain much of a living.
Yes. And are you still playing?
Not so much. I have some physical issues.
Right. I mean, obviously there's COVID on at the moment, which is rather...
Well, that would be constraining as well.
Cuts down all live performances anyway, but...
I'm not performing much anymore.
Right. Well, Stephen, thank you ever so much for your time. That's been fascinating conversation. I say it's a topic we've never actually covered before on the show. Certainly not from someone from, if you like, the academic side of things, as opposed to people claiming, but without any actual evidence that they have these powers. So thank you ever so much for your time, and good luck with all your projects you're working on.
Thank you, and thank you for reaching across the pond.
That's my pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Once again, thank you to Dr. Stephen Braude, and you can discover more about his activities and books on his website, which is at www.jazzphilosopher.com. Now for a weird tale that is so strange that if you published it as fiction, people would say, "Nah, get out of here, that's totally preposterous." Anyway, the location is the small Arizona town of Quartzsite, and we're talking about the red ghost that apparently once haunted the area. Back in the 1870s and early 1880s, stories spread throughout Arizona of a giant red horse with the devil on its back. This was the Red Ghost. The Red Ghost apparently trampled a woman to death at one settlement, tore through another settlement, causing damage, and supposedly flipped over 2 freight wagons at a third settlement. At the scene of each event were signs of the creature, enormous hoof marks, larger than those of any horse, and strands of a reddish-coloured hair. The legend of the Red Ghost lasted for about a decade, until a farmer found a red camel grazing in the Arizona backwoods with the skeletal remains of a man strapped to its back. The red ghost, it transpired, was a straggler from the US Army experiment to set up a camel corps in the American Southwest, or Great American Desert as it was called in those days. The project had begun in the late 1850s, but then the Civil War intervened and the area was occupied by Confederate troops until 1865, after which the project was wound up and the US Army opted to stick with horses and mules. Most of the camels were rounded up and sold. However, some roamed free for many years after the war, including the red camel that had given rise to the red ghost story. Well, that's one mystery solved, but nobody can explain the corpse strapped to its back. Who was he? We don't know. How did he get there? We also don't know. As for Quartzsite, it's a small town on Interstate 10 and is, these days, a popular winter camping area for RV van dwellers. Its tourist attractions include a gum museum carrying a large collection of chewing gum wrappers, and it's also the location for the burial site of Hajid Ali, popularly known as High Jolly. High Jolly was a citizen of the former Ottoman Empire, we're talking now in the mid-19th century, who was hired by the US Army to lead the camels during the Camel Corps experiment. After it was wound up, he continued to live in Quartzsite, working as a drover and also a scout for the American Army. And he died there just under 100 years ago in 1902. A monument was subsequently erected over his grave, taking the form of a large stone pyramid topped with a metal camel. The town also has a steel sculpture made of old car wheels commemorating the red ghost. So, if you're ever on Interstate 10 in Arizona, there's a couple of things to look at in Quartzsite. Here's an anniversary that you've probably not got in your diary. It's the 20th of January, and that's Baba Yaga Day. Yep, Baba Yaga is the Slavic crone woman. She's often depicted as an old hag who lives in the deep woods in a hut surrounded by a fence made of human bones and skulls. She is described as dark, rude, crude and shrewd. But her frightening exterior hides her inner beauty. It's said she guards the waters of life and death. And for those of you that way inclined, it's suggested that on Baba Yaga Day, that's the 20th, you should phone or visit an elderly neighbour or relative. I see what you're doing there. Anyway, put that in your diary. Time for another true winter ghost story, and this week we are going back to the London Underground Network, or the Tube as we call it in the UK. Our location is Covent Garden Station and the westbound platform of the Piccadilly line, which is said to be haunted by the ghost of the Victorian-era actor William Terrace. Terrace was murdered nearby on the 16th of December 1897. In his day, Terrace was one of the most popular actors on the English stage. I suppose his modern day equivalents would be somebody like Hugh Grant or Hugh Laurie or Benedict Cumberbatch. Anyway, William Terrace was stabbed to death outside the stage door of the Adelphi Theatre on Maiden Lane, which is also in Covent Garden, by a disgruntled and deranged actor called Richard Archer Prince. Prince would spend the remaining 40 years of his life locked up in the notorious Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. As for Terrace, his ghost, described as tall in stature, wearing a grey suit and white gloves, is said to be seen standing on the platform very late at night around midnight during the winter months. The last reported sighting of his ghost was in 1972. However, you can still see a plaque on the wall by the stage door of the Adelphi Theatre, which records the events of his death.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints, 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now.
And that's it. Time for me to go, but before I do, I'm signing off with some words of wisdom from this week's guest, Dr. Stephen Braude. He has them as quotes on his email signature. The first is by the artist and writer Ashley Brilliant. If you never try anything new, you'll miss out on many of life's great disappointments. And then we have from the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, it is only when you see a mosquito landing on your testicles that you come to realise that there can be value in solving problems without using violence. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you for listening in. Please join me again next time. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.